A grieving widower takes in an orphan girl out of duty. But when she whispers "Mama," while thinking he's asleep, something buried in him begins to shake. The storm had passed by midnight, but the wind kept whimpering through the broken shutters like a wounded animal. Jonathan Pike, a man once tall with pride but now hunched by sorrow, sat stiff in the old rocker, boots unmoving on the creaky floorboards of his lonely mountain cabin. 3 winters had passed since pneumonia took his wife, Miriam, in the dead of February, and 2 since the last of his children had succumbed to the same fate. Since then, Jonathan had not spoken more than a dozen words to another soul, nor had he let anyone near his land. His grief had twisted into solitude, and then into silence. But tonight, the silence had a heartbeat not his own. The girl was no more than 7, skin caked in dirt, hair tangled with dried thistle, eyes swollen from the cold wind. When the preacher brought her to the doorstep that morning, Jonathan hadn't even stepped out to greet them, just cracked the door enough to see what burden had arrived. "This here's Lee," the preacher said, his voice hoarse from the climb. "She ain't got nobody. Found her half-starved by the train tracks near Bitter Hollow. Folks at the mission say she don't speak. Thought maybe, well, maybe you had space." Jonathan had stared, not at the girl, but at the snowy hills behind her. His hand trembled slightly on the doorknob. "I don't got space for nothing but quiet. She don't make much noise." Silence. The preacher cleared his throat. "She's been sleepin' in the hayloft with the horses. Mice chewed her shoes clean through. Maybe just for a week. Get her warm, then I'll come back." Jonathan shut the door. But something made him open it again. He didn't know why. Could have been the wind shifting, or the way the girl didn't cry. Not a tear, not a flinch, just stared down at her own cracked hands like she expected nothing and deserved less. He looked down at her then, really looked. "All right," he muttered. Now, hours later, she slept curled on the bearskin rug near the hearth, arms wrapped around her knees, face turned from the fire. Jonathan hadn't spoken to her since giving her half a tin of beans and a blanket. She hadn't spoken either, just nodded when he pushed the bowl toward her. But she had taken the blanket with hands that trembled, and when she laid down, she did it like someone afraid to be caught resting. Now Jonathan stared at her from the rocker, pretending to be asleep. He'd told himself it was curiosity, nothing more, that he was watching to make sure she didn't steal, or scream in her sleep, or wet herself, any excuse really. But the truth was darker. He needed to know if she was real. Because the quiet she brought didn't feel like peace. It felt like a match struck too close to his own wounds. And as the fire dimmed and the embers breathed low, Jonathan let his eyelids sag, just enough to trick her, just enough to see. The girl stirred. He kept still. She pushed the blanket down her arms, crouched, crept toward the hearth. Her movements were slow, careful, like she'd done this in other cabins, watched other men, measured danger before daring to speak. She picked up a chunk of wood and placed it gently on the fire. No sound, just a whisper of ash. Then she turned. He thought she'd go back to sleep. But instead she stood over him, just stood there, arms limp at her sides, head tilted. Jonathan fought the urge to shiver. She leaned close, too close, her face near his cheek. And then he heard it, just barely. "Mama." The sound was so faint he wasn't sure it was real. Just one word, cracked like an old bell. His eyes snapped open. She froze. They stared at each other, 2 ghosts caught pretending. But she didn't cry, she didn't beg. She just whispered, sorry, and backed away, curling into the rug again, turning her face from him. Jonathan stayed frozen in the chair, the word echoing through his ribs like thunder across a canyon. "Mama." He hadn't heard that word in this house in years. Not since Miriam's last breath had stirred the rafters. He didn't sleep that night, nor the next. But she did. Every night, curled in that same spot, hands around her knees, silent as snow. And every night, she whispered the same word when she thought he was sleeping. It wasn't always the same tone. Sometimes it trembled. Sometimes it pleaded. Once it laughed, as if remembering something. Jonathan tried to pretend he didn't care, that he didn't listen, that the sound didn't make his chest ache in ways that terrified him. But one morning, as he stepped outside to split firewood, he found her sitting on the porch bench, barefoot, staring at the valley. The sky was pale with dawn. She didn't turn when he approached. "You ever gonna speak proper?" he asked, more gruffly than intended. She didn't answer. He nodded to her feet. "Shoes'll come, I reckon." Still no response. He exhaled, set the axe aside, sat on the edge of the porch, just near enough to her to feel the chill coming off her skin. "I had a daughter once," he said. "Looked not much older than you when she passed." Still silence. She used to hum in her sleep, like bird song, couldn't ever remember the tune when she woke, though. Lee didn't look at him, but her lips parted slightly. A flicker of something, recognition, passed across her face. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You hum." She gave the faintest shake of her head. He stood abruptly. "This ain't no orphanage," he snapped too loud. "You're just here till the preacher finds somewhere better." And he stormed back inside, not daring to glance over his shoulder. That night he sat in his rocker again, pretending. She didn't get up, didn't whisper, didn't move. And that's what scared him most. By the third week, the snow had softened enough to crunch wet under Jonathan's boots instead of crack like glass. He didn't mark days with a calendar anymore, hadn't since Miriam passed, but he counted the number of times the girl had eaten from his table. 17, including the night he'd slid her a cup of weak coffee, and she'd sipped it slow like it was gold. She still hadn't said more than 2 words to him, sorry, that first night. After that, silence. But she moved differently now, quieter, not with fear but with something else, a kind of shame that didn't belong in a child's bones. She walked like someone who thought the floorboards might punish her, like someone who knew that love could vanish and hands could hurt. Jonathan watched her as he chopped kindling, eyes darting to the cabin window. She was inside, brushing dust off one of the old picture frames he hadn't dared look at in years. The one with his sons, Sam and Ben, and his wife, all caught in mid-laughter under a cottonwood tree, faces full of life before the sickness came. Lee stood before it like it was a church altar. And Jonathan's axe struck the log a little harder than necessary. He didn't know what to do with her. She didn't ask for anything, not even a second helping at dinner. She folded her own blanket, swept the hearth when the ashes piled up, watered the horse, even though he'd never asked her to. She had a way of making herself smaller, quieter, like she didn't want to be seen, only tolerated. It unsettled him. A child shouldn't know how to disappear. But Jonathan had no experience with gentle things anymore. Not since the coughing started. Not since Miriam lay on that bed, eyes glazed with fever, whispering, "Don't let the house go cold, John." He hadn't, not until now. Now it felt colder than it ever did without her. Because Lee brought with her a strange warmth that terrified him. He heard it again that night. As always, he pretended to sleep, body rigid in the rocker, breathing deep and slow. The fire had burned low, flickering across the log beams. She was under her blanket again, but this time not curled tight, just flat on her back, staring up. And then, in a trembling voice, barely louder than wind, "Mama, I'm good now, I swear. I didn't touch nothing. I even said the prayer like you taught." Jonathan's breath caught. He stayed frozen. "Don't let them take me again. Please, I'll be good. I'll never talk back." Then silence. He opened his eyes slowly. She was shaking, but her eyes were closed, and tears slipped down the sides of her face into her tangled hair. A prayer, she said a prayer. He hadn't prayed in years. Not since the day he buried his family in the frozen ground and cursed the sky for taking them. But that night, as he lay stiff under the quilt on his bed, after finally giving it up to the girl to sleep by the fire, Jonathan whispered one line into the rafters. "Lord, I don't know what to do with her." The next day brought company. A knock at the door near supper jolted them both. Lee dropped the tin plate she was drying, and it clattered against the floor. Jonathan stepped in front of her instinctively, hand brushing the rifle by the doorway. "Who is it?" he called. The voice on the other side was deep, measured. "Sheriff Rowe, Jonathan, just me." Jonathan opened the door halfway. The sheriff stood with his hat in hand, snow melting off his coat. "Even in." "Even in," Jonathan said flatly. He saw the sheriff's eyes glance past him, into the dim room, landing on Lee. She shrank behind Jonathan's side. Rowe gave a slow nod. "Didn't come to cause trouble, just checking in. Heard the preacher dropped off a girl here." "She's fine." "I don't doubt it. Just that, well, her name come up in town again. The woman who used to foster her, Miss Phelan, showed up asking around." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "She want her back." Rowe rubbed the brim of his hat. "Don't seem like it, but folks say the girl ran. Said she took a silver brooch, too. Miss Phelan made a fuss about it." Jonathan glanced at Lee. Her face had gone ghost pale. Rowe sighed. "She tell you any of that?" "She don't talk." Well, Miss Phelan ain't pressin' charges. Reckon she just wants to make the girl look bad so the next place won't take her. Same as always." "She's not leavin' here," Jonathan said before he could think. Rowe blinked. "I didn't say she had to." "I mean it." Rowe nodded slowly, reading more into the words than Jonathan intended. "You sure you're all right, John?" "Fine. You've been up here alone too long. Folks worry." "Folks should mind their own." "Fair enough." Rowe tipped his hat. "You need anything, send word. Snow's melting. Roads'll clear soon." Jonathan shut the door without another word. Behind him, Lee sat with her knees drawn up, eyes wide and glassy. "Did you take the brooch?" he asked, voice quiet. She opened her mouth, closed it, then nodded once. "Why?" She didn't answer. Jonathan sank into the chair across from her, staring into the fire. "I once stole a coin from my brother when I was 8, bought licorice with it, couldn't even finish it. Guilt made me sick." Still no response. He rubbed his face with one hand. "Did she hurt you, Lee?" A pause. Then she nodded again. His jaw clenched. "I don't care about no brooch." He stood, walked to the cupboard, came back with a pair of worn boots, too small for a grown man but large for her feet. "These were Sam's, my boy's." She looked up. "You wear them if you like. He wants someone to." She took them without a word, but her hands trembled when she did. That night he didn't pretend to sleep. He lay on the bed, staring at the beams, listening to her breath by the hearth. No whisper came. It almost disappointed him. Almost. Then just before dawn, she whispered something different. "I know you ain't really asleep." Jonathan let out a long breath. She continued, "I talked to Mama anyway, just in case." A beat. "I know she ain't here, but sometimes it helps." Jonathan blinked into the dark. And something broke inside him, not painfully, but like frost cracking under early spring sun. He sat up slowly. "You ever see her in dreams?" Silence. Then, "No, just remember how her hands felt when I was little." He got up, walked over, sat down near her feet. "I remember Miriam's hands too, my wife. She used to hold the back of my neck when I was angry, said I clenched like a mule." A ghost of a smile passed across Lee's face. Jonathan looked at the boots she wore now, scuffed, half-laced. Sam had been 10 when he outgrew them. "I used to pray for dreams," he said, "of her, of my boys, but they never came." "Maybe they will," Lee whispered. He nodded. "Maybe they will." The thaw came fast that spring. Rivers swelled, roads turned to muck, but so did the house change. Lee began speaking quietly at first, asking if he wanted tea, if she could help with the horse. She never asked for anything for herself, not even when she sliced her hand gathering firewood, just wrapped it in cloth and hid the blood. He found out anyway. She flinched when he reached to change the bandage. "I ain't gonna hit you," he said, sharper than he meant. Her eyes said she wasn't so sure. He softened. "You're not in trouble." She nodded slowly. He went quiet. Later that week, he found her on the porch again, watching the mountains. "You ever been to the canyon past Bitter Hollow?" she asked suddenly. He shook his head. "Never had reason. My mama used to say it was where angels practiced flying." He smiled. "She said if I ever got lost, I could stand at the edge and they'd carry me home." He looked at her. "You ain't lost now." She looked down at her hands. "No, but I don't know where home is either." Jonathan stood stretched and looked out at the horizon. "You hungry?" She nodded. He smiled. "Come on then, I think there's still some beans left." That night, for the first time, Jonathan didn't pretend to sleep at all. And for the first time, the girl didn't whisper. Instead, as the fire crackled low, she crept from her place, pulled the quilt from his lap and tucked it higher over his chest. Then, thinking he'd gone to sleep, she bent down close to his face again. But this time she didn't say "Mama." She whispered, "I know you miss her. I miss mine too." Jonathan's hand moved before he knew it, reaching gently to touch her hair. She didn't flinch. He didn't shake. Not that night. But the next night would be different. Because the letter came in the morning, folded in the saddlebag of the preacher's mule, addressed in a crooked hand. From Miss Fellin. And it said, "The girl is mine by law. I'm common to collect her by week's end." The wind changed that afternoon. Not in speed or strength, but in direction. It came down from the northern ridge, where hawks circled and the sky broke open wide, and it whispered through the pines like it carried news meant only for those who'd already lost too much. Jonathan Pike stood at the fence line, staring across the melting snowfields with the letter clutched in his hand, the ink already smudged from his grip. He hadn't told Lee. Couldn't bring himself to. She was inside, humming softly while sweeping the hearth. A child's hum, crooked, off-key, but real. The same child who once curled like a feral cat beside his fire was now making noise, without apology. He hadn't realized how much he needed that sound until it drifted from the window and broke whatever strength he had left. He crumpled the letter in his fist and shoved it in his coat pocket. But that didn't make it disappear. Miss Fellin was coming, and by law she was right. Lee wasn't his. Not really. And yet every part of him bristled at the thought of her riding away in some stranger's cart, her little hands clutched around nothing, her voice drying up once more. She wouldn't speak again, he knew that in his gut. Wouldn't laugh, wouldn't hum. He remembered the bruises. The way she flinched when he reached for the tea kettle. The way she curled her feet under her when the sheriff knocked, like footsteps meant punishment. He remembered her whispering "Mama" into the dark, night after night. And that last one, "I know you miss her, I miss mine too." It had unstitched him, quietly, thoroughly. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was the sound of Miriam's hands in his hair, the echo of his boy's footsteps on the porch, the answer to the question he didn't know he'd been asking for 3 empty winters. He went inside. She looked up, brush in hand, face streaked with soot from the ashes. He cleared his throat. "You hungry?" She smiled. I found the last potato. He nodded, forcing his face to stay calm. You can eat it. You sure? He nodded again. I'll be down at the spring. Call if you need anything. She didn't ask why his voice sounded different. She just smiled, real and small, and went back to her sweeping. Jonathan sat by the spring until dusk, letter still in his pocket, but now limp with sweat and guilt. He didn't know what he was capable of. Not anymore. The idea of hiding her, of lying, of running. Would the Lord forgive that? Was it even wrong to keep a child from pain? He'd lost too much to let that happen again, and yet he could already hear the preacher's voice if he refused. John, you can't just decide the law don't matter no more. But what about love? Didn't that count for something? The wind kicked up dust along the trail behind the ridge, and in that dust he saw a silhouette, a rider. It was too soon, days too soon. He stood. The figure was distant, barely more than a speck, but it wasn't the preacher. It wasn't the sheriff either. He waited until the rider vanished beyond the next bend. Then he turned and walked back fast. That night he didn't sit in his rocker. He sat on the floor beside the hearth while Lee plucked at the broken-stringed banjo she'd found in the loft. She didn't know how to play, but it didn't matter. The clumsy notes were better than silence. Where'd you learn to hum like that? He asked. She shrugged. Mama used to sing when she scrubbed clothes. I just remember little pieces. He nodded. You ever hear about the canyon where angels practiced flying? She asked again, her voice brighter now. He chuckled. Yeah, I believe you told me. She swung her legs under the blanket. It's a good place. I've never seen it, but I think about it a lot. He didn't speak. Instead, he stood, walked over to the cupboard and pulled out an old map, rolled it across the table. She climbed up onto a chair, wide-eyed. That it? He asked, pointing. She squinted, then nodded. Right there, where the ridge turns sharp. He marked it with a piece of coal. You'd want to go. Her eyes lit up. Could we? He gave a slow nod. Might be good to see it before spring rains wash the trail out. She tilted her head. You all right, Mr. Pike? He looked at her, just thinking. That night after she went asleep, he packed a small bag. And then he sat in the rocker and whispered something of his own. Miriam, tell me what's right. They left before dawn. Lee didn't ask why. She just followed as he saddled the mule and tied down the pack. She clutched a small tin box she'd taken to keeping by her blanket. He never asked what was inside. She never offered. They rode for hours along the ridge trail, past snow-wet stones and pine stands just beginning to green. When they stopped to rest, Jonathan handed her a piece of jerky and looked her straight in the eyes. I need to tell you something. She chewed slowly. A woman named Miss Phelan, she wrote to say she's coming. She wants to take you back. Lee froze. The jerky dropped into the snow. I didn't take nothing, she said quickly. Only the brooch, but she said if I gave it back she'd stop. Jonathan's chest tightened. You gave it back. Lee nodded. She told me I'd always be a thief, that even if I prayed, God wouldn't hear me. Jonathan's eyes darkened. She said I was too loud, that I made people tired. That's why she locked me in the woodshed. Jonathan took a breath so deep it hurt. You're not going back there. Lee looked up at him, blinking. But the law. I don't care about the law right now. She didn't speak again, just stared at him like someone trying to remember a dream that might not have been real. They reached the canyon by sunset. It wasn't much to look at, not in the way she'd imagined. Just a jagged drop between two cliffs where wind carved the stone into shapes that resembled wings and whispers. Lee stepped to the edge, arms out. Jonathan watched her silhouette against the orange sky. They'd fly here, she said, right over that tree. He smiled. You really believe that? She nodded. I have to. She pulled the tin box from her coat, opened it. Inside was a torn piece of cloth, a rusty thimble, and a string with 2 wooden beads. These were hers. He knelt beside her. You want to leave Em here? She thought about it, then shook her head. I want to keep her with me. He nodded. That's good. They camped by the canyon that night. She slept soundly for the first time since she'd come. And he didn't pretend anymore. He stayed up, eyes to the stars, whispering a different kind of prayer. One that had no words, only ache. Miss Phelan arrived at the cabin 2 days later. But the preacher was there waiting. And the sheriff. The mule still tied to the post, the fire still warm in the hearth. But no one inside. Just a note on the table. Sheriff Rowe picked it up. He read it twice, then handed it to the preacher. It said, Gone to see the canyon. She's not lost anymore. Neither am I, Jonathan Pike. Miss Phelan sputtered. You're just gonna let him take her. The sheriff folded his arms. He didn't take her. She walked beside him. She's mine by law. The preacher sighed. Maybe so, but she was never yours in spirit, and the Lord don't deal in paperwork. Miss Phelan fumed. I'll ride after them. I'll have him jailed. Rowe shook his head. Trails gone cold. Snow melted off fast this year. Miss Phelan cursed under her breath. But no one stopped her when she turned and rode away. She never came back. It was nearly summer when Jonathan and Lee returned. The wildflowers had bloomed along the trails, and the cabin smelled of pine and old books again. Jonathan unpacked slow. Lee set her little box on the mantel. He'd made her a shelf for it. She placed it there gently, then turned to him. Are you still gonna pretend to sleep? He chuckled. Not anymore. Good, 'cause I got lots of prayers to say, and some of 'em need 2 voices. He smiled. Well, I suppose I can learn to pray again. She walked over, tugged his hand, and said something she never had before. Papa. His breath caught. He didn't cry. But he shook. And he held her like a storm had passed through him, and left everything standing. Summer in the high country came like a song half remembered, gentle, hesitant, blooming in places Jonathan Pike had long forgotten could feel warmth. The cabin that had once stood like a monument to grief now breathed again, with laughter, with footsteps, with the occasional off-tune hymn hummed by a child at the wash basin. Lee had changed everything. But not like a fire changes wood. More like how rain wakes seeds sleeping in dust. She didn't speak often, and when she did, it was never for the sake of noise. She measured her words like they cost something, and Jonathan listened to each one like a man starving for something he didn't know he'd missed. She called him Papa now. Not every day, not in front of others. But sometimes, when she was tired or smiling, or reaching for his hand without realizing it. And every time she did, he felt something old and sacred rise in his chest, something like forgiveness. Not from God. From himself. He hadn't known that was even possible. One afternoon, as Lee folded linens out on the line, she paused mid-fold and looked toward the trail. Jonathan followed her gaze and saw the preacher's mare climbing the slope, the man riding slow, his hat pulled low against the sun. Jonathan wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped onto the porch. The preacher nodded, dismounted, and tied the reins. I brought mail, he said. Jonathan's jaw tensed. It ain't from her, the preacher added, seeing his face. She give up. She's too proud to admit she lost, too cowardly to keep fighting, but I heard she's left the territory. Some distant cousin took her in. Jonathan gave a slow nod. The preacher dug into his satchel, and pulled out a folded paper. This came from the orphan registry. Thought you'd want to see it. Jonathan took it. Lee stood behind him now, arms at her sides, watching carefully. He opened the letter and read. By official decree, and given circumstances surrounding the abandonment, mistreatment, and lack of legal claim by prior caretaker, Lee, last name unknown, is considered a ward without claim. Any party offering continued, stable guardianship in a documented home will be considered suitable adoptive kin under homestead provisions. Jonathan read it again, then handed it to Lee. She read slowly, mouthing some of the words. Her eyes widened. Does that mean? He knelt beside her. It means we don't have to hide. She didn't cry. She just let out a breath like she'd been holding it since birth. And for the first time, he saw what peace looked like on her face. They celebrated that night. Not with noise or fuss, but with quiet things that mattered more. Jonathan cooked venison with wild sage. Lee laid the table with the old checkered cloth that had once belonged to Miriam. They lit every oil lamp in the cabin and kept the fire going, even though the air was warm. Feels like we're making noise with light, Lee said, smiling. He smiled too. She played the banjo again, still only half in tune. He tapped his boot to the rhythm. Papa. He turned to her. If Mama's in heaven, do you think she can see me now? He looked into her eyes. I think she's never stopped. Lee nodded slowly, pressing her lips together, holding something back. Then she reached for her tin box and brought it over. Can I show you something? He nodded. She opened the lid, took out the piece of cloth and the beads, but beneath them, tucked so carefully he'd never noticed, was a folded note, yellowed, torn. She handed it to him. Jonathan unfolded it. The writing was shaky, but still legible. To whoever finds her, she's good. Please be better to her than I could. Forgive me. No signature. He looked up. She left this in the woodshed, Lee said softly, after she locked me in. Jonathan folded the paper back. And something inside him shifted again. Not broken. Not shattered. But rearranged. Like a field plowed after too many years left fallow. She knew, he said, even if she couldn't love you the way you deserved, she knew someone should. Lee blinked fast. Then she whispered, maybe that's why I kept praying, even when it didn't make sense. He leaned forward and took her hand. It made sense to me. They sat in silence. The fire cracked. And outside, the wind stirred leaves in the moonlight like an old woman shaking out a quilt of memories. By midsummer, their days had rhythm. Lee fed the hens. Jonathan mended the back gate. They rode into town every third Sunday for service, where Lee sat beside him in the pew and sang hymns with a voice still soft, still unsure but growing. The townsfolk noticed. Sheriff Rowe even said so one day, leaning on his cane outside the general store. Girl S got more light in her than the rest of us put together. Jonathan smiled. She earned it. The preacher nodded, so did you. They watched as Lee picked out sugar drops from a glass jar, her face bent in quiet concentration. She's gonna ask about your past one day, the preacher said. I know. You gonna tell her. Every part. Even the angry ones. Jonathan looked toward the hills. Especially those. The questions started soon after. They came slow. One here, one there. Were your boys older than me? Yes, Sam was 10, Ben was 8. Did they look like you? He chuckled, they looked better. Do you miss them every day? Yes. Do you ever talk to them like I talk to Mama? Not aloud. She paused. Maybe you should. He smiled. Maybe I should. One night, thunder rolled in over the hills. Lee bolted upright in her cot. Jonathan, already awake, stood and walked over. She didn't cry, but her breath came sharp. I thought I was back in the woodshed, she admitted, ashamed. He knelt beside her. You're not. Can I sleep closer to the fire? Course. She dragged her blanket over, curled up near his rocker. He sat above her, watched her settle, listened to the rain. And then her voice. Papa. Yes. If you pretend to sleep tonight, I might still whisper. He smiled. I won't pretend anymore. She nodded. But later, just before sleep took her, he heard it anyway. A whisper. So quiet it barely stirred the room. Thank you, Mama, for sending me to him. Jonathan wiped his eyes and didn't say a word. Late that August, a stranger came riding up the trail. Young, nervous, dressed like a city clerk. He introduced himself as Franklin Hodge, from the Bureau of Homestead Affairs. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said quickly. Just here to confirm a few things, routine checks. Jonathan led him inside. Lee poured tea. The man asked questions. Jonathan answered plainly. Yes, the child had been left in his care. No, there was no blood relation. Yes, the prior caretaker had abandoned her. And yes, she called him Papa now. When it was done, Franklin stood and nodded. You've done right by her. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. You needed to see that with your own eyes. Honestly, Franklin shrugged. There's 100 reports like hers, most don't end like this. Lee came over and stood beside Jonathan. He put a hand on her shoulder. She's mine now, he said. Franklin nodded. I'll file it as such. Then he looked at Lee. You all right, miss? She nodded. I was, but I am now. Franklin's face softened. Well, God bless then. He left. They watched him go until the dust settled behind his horse. That night they didn't light the lamps. Just watched the stars through the window, side by side in the rocker. No pretending. No testing. Just the sound of two hearts finally quiet enough to rest. And in that silence, Lee whispered, not out of habit but gratitude. Mama, I don't need to whisper anymore. He hears me now. Jonathan didn't shake. He just closed his eyes and breathed. And whispered back, I hear you too. The first frost came early that year. Not a hard one, just enough to crisp the leaves and whisper warning to the trees. Jonathan Pike woke with the scent of pine smoke in his nose and the sound of Lee's quiet footsteps padding toward the hearth. She didn't need waking anymore. She'd taken to mornings like they were missions, brushing ashes, stoking the fire, humming low as she worked. He listened for a moment longer, letting her song settle over him like a blanket warmer than wool. It was the same tune she always returned to, the half-remembered hymn her mother used to hum while wringing out clothes. No words, just the melody. It had no name, but in this house it meant home. When he finally swung his legs over the bed, Lee had already set the kettle on and laid out 2 tin cups. She looked up from the fire and smiled the way she only did before noon, gentle, sleepy, unguarded. Chilly out, she said, wrapping her shawl tighter. Jonathan nodded. Sky's clear, though, might stay cold. Means the deer'll come lower, she said, mimicking what he'd told her weeks before. Smart girl. She beamed and went back to the fire. He watched her from the doorway, just long enough for the lump in his throat to catch him off guard. That used to be Ben's seat, right by the hearth. But now it was hers. Not a replacement. A resurrection. And he thanked God for it, quietly, fiercely. Later that morning, they set out to chop firewood. Lee insisted on helping now. She wasn't strong enough to split logs, but she could stack them, straighten them, balance them like a puzzle. Jonathan worked steadily, sweat gathering at his collar even in the crisp air. He stole glances at her between swings. She moved like a child should, careful, yes, but not fearful. Her eyes scanned the woods with curiosity now, not dread. She whistled softly as she worked. Then mid-stack she stopped. He noticed her stillness before he saw the reason. A figure on the trail. Too far to make out at first. Jonathan wiped his brow and squinted. Then he cursed himself for slipping into fear so fast. It was Miss Phelan. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't anyone from town. It was a woman. Riding slow, alone, hat low, scarf high, posture tired. Lee gripped the hem of Jonathan's coat. "Papa." He stepped in front of her slightly. "Go inside, don't ask, just go." She obeyed. The woman dismounted 30 feet out, leading her horse with care. Her clothes were threadbare, travel-stained, her boots too large for her feet. She stopped short of the fence. Jonathan called out, "You lost." Her voice was raspy, "Maybe." He stepped closer, hand resting near his belt, no weapon drawn, just ready. "You sick?" "No." "Hurt?" "Only a little." She took off her scarf. Jonathan blinked. She was young, maybe 25, skin sallow, eyes rimmed with shadows. Her face didn't match her age, too worn, too weary. "You lookin' for someone?" She hesitated. "No, just needed to find a light, saw your smoke." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "Well, you found it." "I don't need nothing, just a spot to sit. I'll be gone by sundown." "You come from town?" She shook her head, further. He studied her, then glanced at the door where he knew Lee stood just inside, probably watching through a crack. "I got a daughter in there," he said. The woman nodded. "I ain't no threat." He believed her. But belief wasn't trust. "You can water your horse, then I'll bring you coffee." "Bless you." She didn't step forward, just stood there a minute longer before walking to the trough. Jonathan stepped inside. Lee stood by the door. "Who is she?" she whispered. "Don't know yet. She looks like she don't got anywhere." He nodded. "Like I used to look." He nodded again. Then he poured 2 cups and carried one outside. The woman sat on a log near the fence now, her coat around her knees. He handed her the cup. She took it with both hands, inhaled the steam and sighed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Call me Hope." He raised an eyebrow. "That your real name?" She smirked. "It's what I'm trying to have." Jonathan didn't push. They sat in silence a moment. She sipped, then said, "You ever lose everything, Mr. Pike? You ever lose it all?" He met her eyes. "Yes." She nodded. "Then you understand why I'm here." "I don't understand anything yet. I'm not asking for a room or food, just the porch tonight. I'll move on tomorrow." He sighed. "I got a barn, it's warmer." Her eyes filled. "Thank you." She slept in the barn that night. But Lee didn't sleep at all. "What if she's like Miss Phelan?" she whispered after the lamps were out. "She's not." "How do you know?" "I don't." Lee hugged her knees. Jonathan reached over and pulled the quilt higher on her. "Trust ain't about certainty, it's about choosing." "I'm scared," she said. He nodded. "Me too." In the morning, the barn was empty. Hope was gone. But in her place, folded neatly on the hay bale, was the empty coffee cup and a note. "Thank you for believing I could be better than where I came from." Lee stared at it a long time. "Maybe she was sent to remind us," she said softly. "Of what?" "That we were once strangers too." Autumn deepened. The leaves caught fire in gold and rust. Jonathan built a new table. Lee carved her name into the leg. They planted bulbs for spring. He taught her to read. She taught him to laugh again. But one evening, as snow threatened the sky again, Lee came into the cabin pale and shaken. "There's someone on the trail." Jonathan stepped outside. It was Sheriff Rowe. But he wasn't smiling. He dismounted slow, face drawn. "Got news," he said. Jonathan's stomach sank. "What is it?" The sheriff looked down. "There's a boy younger than her, maybe 5, left in a barn outside Bitter Hollow. Folks say he won't speak, just holds a picture of a woman." Lee had crept to the doorway now. Jonathan looked at her, then back at the sheriff. "You think I can help?" Rowe nodded. "I think he needs what she got." Jonathan ran a hand down his face, then nodded. "We'll leave at first light." They found the boy exactly as described. Knees to chest, silent, gripping a water-damaged photo of a woman with long hair and tired eyes. He didn't speak when Lee crouched beside him. Didn't flinch when Jonathan offered bread. Didn't blink when they told him their names. But when Lee whispered, "It's okay, I used to be lost too," his lip trembled. That night they didn't ride home. They stayed in the barn. All 3 of them. Jonathan in the rocker. Lee beside the boy, whispering songs. And in the dark, sometime past midnight, the boy's voice cracked open. "Mama." Jonathan's chest ached. And when Lee reached for the boy's hand and whispered back, "She hears you," he looked to the rafters. And knew Miriam was smiling. The boy's name was Micah. At first, they only learned it by finding it stitched faintly into the inside lining of his coat, the thread loose and frayed. He didn't say it himself. He didn't say much of anything after that first cracked "mama" in the barn. But that one word had been enough to bind the 3 of them together, like threads pulled taut across torn cloth. Jonathan Pike rode with the boy tucked against his chest all the way back through the pass. Lee followed behind on the mule, silent, her arms clutched around the satchel Jonathan had packed in haste. The sky had turned the color of pewter by the time they reached home, and wind swept early snow down in soft whirls. Jonathan built the fire back up while Lee settled the boy on the rug. Micah didn't cry. He just stared into the flames like he was watching something burn that no one else could see. Lee stayed near him, not crowding, just there. She knew that kind of silence too well to try and fill it. Jonathan handed her a bowl of broth. "Try," he said gently. She knelt and lifted the spoon to Micah's lips. To their surprise, he drank. Then again. Then reached out and took the bowl in both hands, sipping on his own slowly. Lee exhaled. He's not scared of the fire. Jonathan sat on the rocker, his knees aching from the cold. That's something. Neither was I, she said, eyes soft. It was people I didn't trust. Jonathan looked at her for a long time and nodded. Micah finished the broth and lay down without a word. He was asleep in seconds. Lee stayed beside him. "Will we keep him?" she asked suddenly. Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out at the falling snow. "I don't know what we're allowed to keep anymore," he said finally, "but I know what we can't let go." He turned back to her. "If you want him here, he stays." She nodded fiercely. And just like that, the cabin grew bigger. Not in size, in meaning. The days that followed were quiet, as if the snow itself hushed the land out of respect for what was unfolding within those 4 walls. Micah didn't speak again. Not at first. But he watched everything. He watched Lee sweep. Watched Jonathan chop wood. Watched the hens scratch through the frost-hardened ground. He didn't cry, didn't laugh, but his eyes began to follow their movements with a kind of desperate hunger, as if learning how to live by copying them. It was Lee who noticed it first. "He blinks like I used to," she whispered to Jonathan one evening as they stood by the barn. "How is that?" "Like he's afraid if he closes his eyes, he'll wake up somewhere else." Jonathan nodded slowly. "He won't," he said. And he meant it. Winter deepened. Micah began to hum. That's how it started. He would sit by the fire, silent for hours, then begin to hum Lee's tune, the one her mother had sung. The first time it happened, Lee froze. She turned to Jonathan, who had dropped his spoon in his lap. Then slowly, she sat beside Micah and hummed with him. He didn't look up, just kept humming. But when he finished, he whispered one word. "Again." Lee smiled through tears. "As many times as you want." Jonathan carved Micah a chair. Too small for any grown man, but just right for a boy learning to sit still without shaking. They placed it beside Lee's near the hearth. At night, the three of them sat there, 2 children wrapped in wool blankets, and one man trying to remember how to feel full. Lee began to teach Micah how to read. Jonathan taught him to whittle, starting with spoons, then toy horses. Micah didn't smile, but his hands began to move with confidence. One morning, after breakfast, he climbed into Jonathan's lap without a word and leaned his head against the man's chest. Jonathan didn't breathe for a moment. Then he laid his calloused hand gently over the boy's back. Micah whispered, "You don't have to be scared, I don't make messes." Jonathan felt something twist behind his ribs. "You can make all the messes you need," he whispered back. Micah nodded against him and stayed there. A letter came midwinter, carried by a trapper who passed through the edge of the trail. It was from Franklin Hodge, the homestead clerk. He wrote, "Heard about the boy. No one else claimed him. There was a fire. His mother didn't survive. Neighbors said the father left months prior. I've filed the paperwork. If you want to keep him, it's yours to say." Jonathan read the letter twice, then handed it to Lee. She read it slowly, lips moving, her brow furrowing in concentration. Finally, she looked up. "He belongs here." Jonathan smiled. "So do you." They told Micah that night. Jonathan knelt beside him while Lee held his hand. "You don't have to leave," Jonathan said. "Not ever. If you want to stay, this is your home." Micah stared at him, then at Lee, then whispered, "I don't have to go back in the barn." "No," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "Never again." Micah's chin trembled. "I want to stay." Lee wrapped her arms around him. And this time Micah cried. Not loud, but long. Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder and let him sob. They didn't speak again that night. But when the fire burned low and the cabin settled into sleep, Jonathan sat in the rocker, eyes to the roof, and prayed. "Lord, I don't know why you chose me for this, but thank you, thank you." In late January, a cough settled in Micah's chest. Just a tickle at first, but then it worsened. Jonathan tried everything: herbs, warm milk, rest, but the cough clung like frost to a window. Lee grew pale watching him. "You don't think," she whispered one night. Jonathan shook his head quickly. "No." "But Papa, what if?" "No." He wouldn't lose another child. He couldn't. 3 days into the fever, Micah's breathing grew shallow. Jonathan sat beside his bed, wiping his brow, trying not to show fear. Lee stood across the room, praying in broken whispers. "Please God, not again, don't take him." Jonathan heard her. And for the first time in a long time, he joined in. He knelt beside the boy and laid his forehead against the edge of the cot. "Take my strength if you have to," he whispered. "Take everything I've got left, just don't take him." Micah stirred. Micah reached up and placed a small hand on his chest. "You shook again." Jonathan let out a sob. "I always will, but I'm not scared." Micah nodded, then closed his eyes and slept. The fever broke before dawn. By noon, he was asking for tea. Lee wept into her hands. Jonathan paced the cabin, unable to stop smiling. He couldn't explain it, couldn't name it, but something had changed. Something eternal. The spring melt came swift. The creek behind the cabin roared with life. Micah ran barefoot in the mud. Lee sang while planting early carrots. Jonathan built a new loft for storage. They didn't call themselves a family in the way people might write on forms. But that's what they were. Not by blood, but by something deeper. Something earned. That summer, Franklin Hodge returned with a folder of papers. He sat at the same table as before, sipping the same weak coffee. "I brought adoption forms," he said. Already, Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Don't worry," Franklin chuckled. "They're pre-approved. I just need signatures." Lee signed hers in slow, careful letters. Micah clutched the pencil with both hands, tongue between his teeth, concentrating. Jonathan signed last, then folded the papers with care and handed them back. Franklin tucked them into his case and stood. "You're officially a father of two." Jonathan looked at the children and said, "No, I'm the son of three." Franklin blinked. "Come again." Jonathan pointed toward the mantel, toward Miriam's photo. "She made this possible. She taught me to love, even in silence." Franklin nodded, then tipped his hat. "I'll be going now." That night, Jonathan sat in the rocker. Lee curled beside him, her head on his arm. Micah lay on the rug, tracing wood grain with his finger. The fire flickered low. "Tell us a story," Micah whispered. Jonathan cleared his throat. "There once was a cabin," he began, "way out past the trail where no one ever went. It was empty, cold, quiet. But one day a whisper found its way inside, and it turned out that whisper was a prayer." Lee looked up at him. Jonathan smiled. "And when the prayer took root, it grew." He looked at both of them. "Into you." Summer rolled across the valley like honey poured over bread, slow, golden, sweet. Days stretched long, bees hummed in the blackberry thickets, and the creak of the cabin's old wood softened into something homely again. Jonathan Pike, once a man carved hollow by loss, found his life brimming in ways that startled him when he paused to notice. Micah and Lee had taken to making noise now. Not the kind that hurt. No shouting, no stomping. Just life's music. Her laughter when he tripped over the wash bucket, his nonsense songs about goats and clouds, the scrape of spoons on empty plates, the whisper of pages turning when Lee read aloud at night. And Jonathan, he had taken to sitting on the porch at sundown, boots kicked up, a cup of bitter coffee cooling in his hand, watching them chase fireflies across the yard. No words could have described what settled in his chest during those moments, but he knew it for what it was. Joy. Not loud. Not blinding. But sturdy. The kind that stayed. The kind he thought he'd buried alongside his wife and sons. It wasn't perfect, of course. Micah still woke from dreams sometimes, calling out for a mother he could barely remember. Lee still paused, wide-eyed, whenever a stranger approached their trail. And Jonathan still walked the woods alone sometimes, speaking to the wind in short, stammered prayers that came like coughs from an unused throat. "Thank you," he'd mutter, or "guide me," or just "please." He didn't ask for much. Not anymore. Not since he'd been given more than he ever thought he'd be strong enough to hold. One hot August afternoon, a letter arrived, hand-delivered by a young woman riding a government mule, cheeks red from sun, her boots dusty and cracked. Jonathan met her at the trailhead, hat low over his brow. "Mr. Pike?" she asked, squinting. "That's me." She reached into her satchel. "Letter from Franklin Hodge. Asked me to bring it straight to your hands." Jonathan took it, nodded thanks, and didn't speak again until she'd ridden off into the trees. He didn't open the letter immediately. Instead, he walked back toward the cabin, eyes scanning the ridge, the fields, the place he'd carved from grief and filled again with love. Micah was napping. Lee sat cross-legged by the stream, sewing a patch onto her apron. He sat beside her and handed her the envelope. She looked at it. "Is it bad?" "Only one way to find out." She opened it carefully, unfolded the page and read in a whisper. Then stopped. Then smiled. And handed it back to him. He read, "Dear Mr. Pike, after months of review and due diligence, I am pleased to inform you that your homestead has been awarded extended tenure based on exemplary guardianship and moral contribution to the local community. In layman's terms, the land is yours and the children are yours in full standing. No further reviews, no questions. Live in peace. Yours faithfully, Franklin Hodge." Jonathan stared at the letter for a long time. Then looked at Lee. "We're permanent," she said. He nodded. Permanent. It was a strange word. He'd spent so long expecting everything good to leave. Now here was proof in ink and signature that they belonged. All of them. The news spread through Bitter Hollow fast. By Sunday, folks in town were smiling wider when they saw the three of them arrive for service. The general storekeeper slipped a tin of peppermint sticks into Micah's hand without a word. The preacher clapped Jonathan on the shoulder and said nothing, just nodded once, his eyes wet. Even the sheriff, gruff as ever, leaned on his cane and muttered, "Told ya." Jonathan didn't say much. He didn't need to. But when the preacher invited Lee to help lead the children's hymn at the end of service, and she stepped up shyly, holding Micah's hand, and they both sang loud and off-key with 10 other orphans from the town, Jonathan wept. Openly. Unashamed. He sat in the back pew and cried like a man being healed from something he'd thought terminal. And afterward, when Lee hugged him in front of the whole congregation and whispered, "You shake when you cry now too," he laughed. He laughed so hard the whole church echoed. Late that night, after Micah had fallen asleep and Lee was brushing her hair by the window, Jonathan lit the lamp one last time. She looked up. "Something wrong?" He shook his head. "Just something I've been holding on to." He reached above the mantel, pulled down a box. Old, dusty, untouched since the day he'd packed it. He opened it. Inside, a ribbon, a journal, a small wooden toy, and a folded letter. He handed it to Lee. "What is it?" she asked. "It's the last thing Miriam wrote me." Lee blinked. He nodded. "She knew she was going, wrote it while I was out looking for herbs to break her fever." Lee unfolded it gently and read aloud. "Jonathan, you were always better at silence than words, so I'll keep this brief. Don't close the door behind me, don't lock it. Someone may need you, and you will need them. Love again, not because I'm gone, but because I was ever here. Let the house stay warm. Yours forever. M." Lee read it again. Then again. Jonathan watched her with quiet reverence. Finally she whispered she knew. He nodded. "She sent you to us." He didn't argue. because it was true. He didn't know how heaven worked, but he knew love didn't end in graves. And sometimes, maybe, it whispered across mountains and trails, into the ears of little girls who curled up beside strangers and whispered "Mama" when they thought no one could hear. Sometimes, maybe, it stitched families from ashes. The next morning, Micah climbed into his arms as he sat on the porch, warm tea in his hand. "Tell me that story again," the boy said. "Which one?" "The one about the cabin and the whisper." Jonathan chuckled. "You remember it." "Some, but I want to hear it from you." Lee joined them, arms full of clean laundry. She sat on the step, smiling. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "there once was a cabin, lonely, quiet, just wood and shadow, no voices, no laughter, until one night a little girl whispered something into the dark." Micah leaned closer. "And that whisper grew roots. It called something back from the dead. It turned silence into song." Lee whispered, "And that's how the house came alive again." Micah nodded. "Did the whisper ever stop?" Jonathan smiled. "No," he said, "it just changed shape." And that evening, as fireflies lit the yard and stars blinked through the dusk, Lee and Micah stood side by side beneath the old oak and began to hum the tune again. The one without words. The one Miriam had sung. And Jonathan, old, weathered, but whole, sat in his chair and listened, his hands shaking just enough to remind him he was still alive. Still learning. Still becoming something new. The first snow of the new winter fell on the morning of Lee's 12th birthday. It came sudden and soft, catching even the weather-wise mule off guard as he blinked at the frost layering his trough. Micah was the first to spot it, his bare feet pattering across the cold floor as he raced to the front window, breath fogging the glass. "It's snowin', Papa, look." Jonathan stirred in his chair by the hearth, rubbing his shoulder the way he always did when the cold came early. He slept lightly, as always. Some habits grief had carved into his bones would never fully go away. But now they didn't haunt him. They just reminded. He stood and crossed the cabin in slow, steady steps, joining the boy at the window. Outside, the trees wore a dusting of white like powdered sugar on burnt bread. The sky was low, the kind of gray that meant snow would fall all day, but gentle, never in a rush. Lee stood just behind them, wrapped in the shawl she'd made herself during the last thaw. Her hair had grown out now, long and thick, kept in a braid most days. She was no longer the tiny, rail-thin girl who'd whispered "Mama" into the dark. She stood taller now. Not grown, but rooted. "Happy birthday," Jonathan said, turning to her. Lee smiled and looked down at her hands. "I almost forgot." "I didn't," Micah chirped, rushing over to the table where he'd hidden a crookedly wrapped package beneath a towel. "Me and Papa made you something." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Thought we were gonna wait till supper." Micah grinned. I want her to have it now." Lee untied the twine and peeled back the fabric. Inside was a wooden box, hand-carved, simple and unpainted. When she opened it, she gasped. Inside were tiny whittled shapes. A bird, a rocking chair, a pine tree, a little fire, and two figures. One tall, one small, holding hands. Micah's eyes sparkled. "It's our story, the way you told it." Lee's lips trembled. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Told him stories matter more when you can hold 'em." She looked at both of them, then carefully lifted the small wooden fire from the box and held it against her chest. "This one's Mama," she said. "I'll keep it with me." Micah hugged her, and Jonathan, awkwardly at first, wrapped his arms around them both. That evening, as the snow thickened and painted the world in silence, Jonathan roasted potatoes by the hearth and let Lee read from the Bible. Her voice was soft but steady, eyes moving slowly across the page. Micah sat cross-legged on the rug, eyes wide, mouthing the words along with her even though he wasn't quite reading yet. And he setteth the solitary in families, Lee read. He bringeth out those which are bound with chains. She paused, then looked up. I think that's what happened to us. Jonathan nodded. I reckon it is. She folded the book closed and hugged it to her chest. Sometimes, she said, I still wake up and wait for everything to vanish. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He stood, added another log to the fire and sat back in his chair. I used to pray that every night would be the last one I had to spend alone. He looked at her. Inside, Jonathan's eyes drifted to the photograph on the mantel, Miriam's smile, forever caught in the sun of a day long gone. He whispered, You'd love them, I know you would. Then he sat back, let the rocker creak and closed his eyes. For once, he wasn't pretending to sleep. But just as he drifted off, he felt a soft tug at the hem of his sleeve. He opened his eyes. Lee stood beside him, the quilt around her shoulders, her face lit by firelight. Papa, she whispered. He blinked slowly. Are you asleep? Not yet. She looked at him for a long moment, then leaned close, closer than she dared in the early days, and laid her head against his chest. Just wanted to be sure. Jonathan smiled. He placed a hand on her hair and breathed deep. You're safe, he said. I'm right here. She nodded. I know. And after a pause, barely audible, she whispered again. Good night, Mama. Micah stirred in his sleep. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, the fire burned low, but it did not die. It would never die again. Not in this house. Not in this family.